I grew up being called the responsible one, the steady one, the daughter who never needed anything, never asked for anything, never made a scene. In our house in Portland, that was just the role I played, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. My younger sister Brielle was the one who lit up every room. She cried louder, laughed harder, and somehow always managed to make every single moment about herself. And my parents, they let her, every single time. I'm Claire. I'm 31 years old. I'm a registered nurse, and I spent the last decade taking care of everyone around me. Patients at work, my parents at home, and especially my sister, who treated my generosity like a subscription service she never had to pay for. I want to tell you about the day of my best friend's wedding. Not because it was the worst day of my life, though for a few hours it felt that way. I want to tell you because it was the day I finally stopped being responsible for everyone else's comfort and started being responsible for my own. But to understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what the years before it looked like. Brielle is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, she was the kind of kid teachers described as spirited. My parents described her as gifted. I described her as gifted. I described her, privately, as exhausting. She wasn't a bad person, not exactly. She was just someone who had been told her whole life that her feelings were the most important ones in any room, and she believed it completely. When I graduated high school with honors, my parents threw a small dinner at home. When Brielle graduated 2 years later, with a GPA half a point lower than mine, they rented out a private room at a restaurant, invited 40 people, and gave a toast that made my mother cry. I sat at that table and smiled and told myself it didn't matter. I was already in nursing school. I was already moving forward. I told myself that a lot back then. The pattern continued into adulthood. When I got my first apartment, I moved in with a second-hand couch and a coffee maker I bought at a garage sale. When Brielle moved into hers 2 years later, my parents quietly paid her security deposit and first 2 months of rent. I found out 3 years after the fact in the middle of an unrelated argument, when my mother let it slip like it was nothing. Like it was obvious. Like of course they had done that. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. That was the problem. I had a best friend named Dana. We met in nursing school during our second year, bonded over a shared hatred of a particular clinical rotation supervisor, and had been inseparable ever since. Dana was sharp, funny, and the kind of person who told you the truth even when it stung. She was also getting married that October, and she had asked me to be her maid of honor. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. The wedding was being held at a vineyard about 2 hours outside of Portland. Dana had been planning it for nearly 18 months. Venue, caterer, florist, photographer, every single detail chosen with the kind of precision that made me love her even more. She had a vision, and that vision was perfect. About 6 months before the wedding, I started quietly picking up extra shifts at work. I had a plan. I wanted to give Dana something real, not just the standard gift offer registry, but something that would actually matter. I had been setting money aside to pay for her honeymoon spa package at the resort where she and her husband were staying, 3 nights of couples treatments, a private dinner, the works. It was nearly $1,800, and I had been building toward it for months without telling anyone. I also offered to coordinate the rehearsal dinner. Dana's future mother-in-law had originally planned to handle it, but she had a health scare 6 weeks before the wedding and couldn't manage the stress. I stepped in without being asked. I called the restaurant, confirmed the head count, handled the dietary restrictions, arranged for the flowers, and made sure every detail was exactly what Dana had described wanting. It took weeks of evenings and weekends. I didn't mind. That's what you do for people you love. What I should have done was keep my mouth shut about it around my family. I made the mistake of mentioning the rehearsal dinner coordination at a Sunday family dinner in September. I was tired and a little proud of myself, and I wanted to share something. My mother said, "That's so thoughtful of you, honey." My father nodded. Brielle looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, Dana's the one getting married at that vineyard place. I follow her on Instagram. That venue looks incredible." Then she went back to scrolling. 2 weeks later, I got a text from Brielle asking if she could come to the wedding as my +1. I should explain something. I had not been given a +1. Dana's wedding was intentionally small. 63 guests, very curated, very intimate. I was the maid of honor. I didn't have an extra seat at a table. There was no casual slot to fill. I texted Brielle back and explained this gently, the way I explained everything to her. She read the message and didn't respond for 4 days. When she did respond, she said, and I am quoting this exactly, "You could have just asked Dana. It's literally her wedding. She would have said yes. You just didn't want me there." I didn't answer that text either. The week before the wedding, my mother called me. She wanted to talk about Thanksgiving. Fine, normal. But then somewhere in the middle of the conversation, she said, casually, like she was mentioning the weather, "Brielle mentioned she wasn't invited to Dana's wedding. That seems a little hurtful, don't you think?" They've met before. They had met once, at a birthday dinner. Brielle had spent most of it on her phone. I told my mother calmly that it wasn't my wedding to invite people to, and that Dana's guest list was intentionally limited. My mother made a sound that I had heard my entire life. Not quite a sigh, not quite a hum. The sound that meant she disagreed with me but wasn't going to say it outright. She changed the subject. I let her. The morning of the wedding, I was at the venue by 7 a.m. The ceremony wasn't until 4 in the afternoon, but there was setup to oversee, a bride to help get ready, and approximately 40 small emergencies to manage before anyone walked down an aisle. I was in my element. I was running on 3 hours of sleep and pure determination, and I was genuinely happy. Dana looked beautiful. The flowers were exactly right. The caterer arrived on time. The photographer was already capturing candid moments of the bridesmaids getting ready. And every time I caught a glimpse of Dana's face in the mirror, that expression of quiet, overwhelming joy, I felt something settle in my chest. The ceremony was perfect. When Dana and her husband said their vows, I cried, and I am not someone who cries easily. I was standing right beside her, holding her bouquet, watching her begin the rest of her life, and I thought to myself, this is exactly where I am supposed to be. The reception started at 6. Dinner was served at 7. Everything was running exactly as planned. That's when my phone started ringing. I saw my mother's name on the screen and let it go to voicemail. I was in the middle of coordinating the cake-cutting timeline with the venue coordinator. My phone rang again. Then a text from my father. "Call us. It's important." I stepped away from the reception hall and called my mother back. She was upset. Genuinely, tearfully upset. And the reason she was calling me at my best friend's wedding reception during the dinner hour on a day I had been working toward for 18 months was Brielle. Apparently, Brielle had seen photos from the wedding on Instagram. Someone had tagged the vineyard, and Brielle had seen pictures of the venue, the decorations, the flowers, the rehearsal dinner setup, and she had called my mother furious. Not at Dana. At me. Because the rehearsal dinner I had coordinated looked, according to Brielle, like something out of a magazine, and Brielle had decided, apparently, that I had planned it specifically to show off. She had also, and this part genuinely took my breath away, told my parents that I had been bragging to people about paying for Dana's honeymoon spa package. I had told exactly one person about that gift. Dana. So either Dana had mentioned it to someone, which she would have done with gratitude and zero malice, or Brielle had fabricated the bragging accusation entirely. Either way, my mother was on the phone with me at my best friend's wedding reception, asking me why I always had to make things a competition. I stood outside that vineyard reception hall in my bridesmaid dress, holding a phone to my ear, and listened to my mother explain that Brielle was upset and that I needed to understand how my actions affected other people. I said very quietly, "I'm at Dana's wedding. I have to go." My mother started to say something else. I hung up. I went back inside. I fixed my expression. I helped cue the first dance. I gave a toast that made people laugh and then cry and then laugh again. And when Dana hugged me afterward, she whispered, "I don't know what I would have done without you today." And I held on to that for the rest of the night like it was something solid. But something had shifted. I drove home at midnight. I had 3 missed calls from my mother, 1 from my father, and a text from Brielle that said, "I heard you hung up on Mom." Nice. I sat in my car in my parking garage for a long time, not crying, just thinking. I thought about the security deposit I had never received. I thought about the 40-person graduation party. I thought about every Sunday dinner where Brielle's opinions were discussed and debated while mine were nodded at and set aside. I thought about the voice my mother used when she talked about Brielle. Warm, indulgent, a little proud even when she was pretending to scold, and the voice she used when she talked about me. Measured, reliable. Claire will handle it. I thought about the $1,800 I had quietly saved, and the weeks of evenings I had spent coordinating a rehearsal dinner, and the fact that not one member of my immediate family had asked me a single question about how the wedding had gone. And then I thought about Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving at my parents' house had been my production for the last 6 years. I planned the menu, bought the groceries, cooked most of the food, and cleaned up afterward while my father watched football and Brielle sat at the table scrolling through her phone and occasionally offering opinions about the stuffing. My mother helped, genuinely, but she also deferred to me on every decision, which meant the labor, the real labor, the invisible organizational labor was mine. This year, I had already confirmed I was coming. I had already started making a list. I took out my phone and I opened the Notes app and I looked at that list for a long time. Then I closed it and went to bed. I didn't call my family back that night or the next morning. My mother texted twice. My father sent one message that said, "Your sister is really hurt. Just wanted you to know." Brielle didn't contact me at all, which was, honestly, the most honest thing she'd done in years. On Tuesday, 4 days after the wedding, I called my mother. I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say, and I said it without raising my voice. I told her that I had been the maid of honor at my best friend's wedding. I told her that I had coordinated the rehearsal dinner on my own time, without being asked, as a gift to Dana and her family. I told her that I had saved for months to give Dana a honeymoon present that meant something. And I told her that receiving a phone call during the reception, not after, not the next day, but during, to be told that my sister was upset about Instagram photos was one of the most disorienting experiences of my adult life. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Brielle just feels like you're always trying to prove something." I prepared for a lot of responses. Not that one. "What am I trying to prove?" I asked. "I don't know, honey, that you're capable, that you're generous. She just feels like there's always a competition." I thought about that for a moment, and then I said, "Mom, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think Brielle feels like there's a competition. I think she feels like she's not winning one she didn't know she'd entered, and those are very different things." Another silence. "I just think you could be a little more sensitive to how I'm not hosting Thanksgiving this year," I said. The silence that followed was different. Longer. Heavier. "What?" "I'm not hosting. I won't be cooking. I'm happy to come and contribute a dish if someone else wants to organize it, but I'm not doing the planning and the shopping and the cooking this year. Claire, I've done it for 6 years. I think it's time for someone else to take a turn." I heard my mother take a breath. "Is this because of what happened with Brielle?" "It's because I've been doing it for 6 years, I said, "and I don't think anyone has noticed." I told her I loved her and I said goodbye. I sat with the phone in my hand and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Relief. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just a quiet, clean sense of having finally said something true. The next 2 weeks were strange. My mother texted occasionally, normal things, forwarded recipes, a photo of the neighbor's new puppy, like the conversation hadn't happened. My father didn't mention Thanksgiving at all. Brielle was silent. And then, 11 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called and asked with a careful brightness in her voice if I had any recipes I could share. For the turkey. Because she was thinking of trying it herself this year. I sent her 3 recipes and a timeline. On Thanksgiving, I drove to my parents' house and brought a green bean casserole and a bottle of wine. My mother was in the kitchen, visibly stressed, flour on her shirt, the turkey slightly more golden than intended but still good. The table was set imperfectly. The centerpiece was a grocery store arrangement instead of the one I usually made from scratch, and there were paper napkins instead of cloth ones. It was fine. It was genuinely fine. Brielle arrived 40 minutes late and made a comment about the stuffing being different from usual. My mother explained she had used a new recipe. Brielle said, "Claire's was better," and looked at me when she said it. and I couldn't entirely tell if it was a compliment or a dig, and then I decided it didn't matter. After dinner, while my mother and I were doing dishes, she said, quietly, with her back to me, "I owe you an apology for calling during the wedding. That wasn't fair. I dried a plate and waited, and I think your father and I think we've let some things go on longer than we should have, with Brielle, with the way we handle things. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything actually for a moment. And then I said, thank you for saying that." She turned and looked at me. "Are you okay?" "I'm getting there," I said. And I meant it. Things didn't transform overnight. Brielle didn't suddenly become a different person. My parents didn't sit down and deliver a formal acknowledgement of every imbalance from the past 3 decades. That's not how families work, and I had stopped expecting it to be. What changed was smaller and more durable than that. I stopped volunteering for things I resented. I stopped absorbing the weight of other people's moods and calling it love. I started saying what I needed, out loud, in plain sentences, and letting other people figure out how to respond. Dana texted me the week after she got back from her honeymoon. The spa package had been, she said, transcendent. Her husband had cried during the couple's massage, which she described as the most romantic thing that had ever happened to her. She wanted to know every detail of how I had planned it and how I was doing and whether I had finally talked to my mother. I told her about the Thanksgiving conversation. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "You know what I kept thinking about during your toast? About how you've been taking care of everyone your whole life and no one takes care of you back?" I didn't know what to say to that. "I'm taking care of myself now," I said finally. "Good," she said. "It's about time." She was right. It was. There's a version of this story where I explode, where I walk out of that reception hall and never speak to my family again, where the credits roll on a clean break and everyone learns their lesson and I ride off into the sunset vindicated. That would have been satisfying to watch, maybe, but that's not what happened, and I think the truth is more useful than the fantasy. What happened is that I got tired of being the person who handled everything and asked for nothing, and then wondered why she felt invisible. Tired of taking the quiet road every time and calling it patience, when really it was just fear. Fear that if I said what I needed, I would be too much. I would be the difficult one. I would become the person they looked at the way they used to look at me when I was young and too serious and not sparkly enough for the room. I was not the sparkly one. I was never going to be the sparkly one. And somewhere between that Thanksgiving and the New Year, I made a kind of peace with that. What I am is the person who shows up. The person who plans the rehearsal dinner and saves for the honeymoon gift and stands at the altar holding the bouquet and means every word of the toast. That's not nothing. That is, actually, quite a lot. The difference now is that I know it, and I don't need anyone else to confirm it anymore. My mother called me in January to ask if I wanted to come to Sunday dinner, just a regular dinner. No occasion, no agenda. She said she was making my grandmother's soup recipe and she wanted me to taste it and tell her if she'd gotten the proportions right. I said yes. I drove over on a Sunday evening and sat at the kitchen table and tasted the soup and told her she had it exactly right, maybe just a pinch more black pepper next time, and she wrote that down on a notepad like it was important information. Brielle was there. She was quieter than usual. At one point, while we were all at the table, she looked at me and said, "How's Dana?" I saw she was back from her honeymoon. "She's great," I said. "Really happy." Brielle nodded. "That's good," she said. It was not an apology. I wasn't sure I needed one anymore. I drove home that night with the windows down even though it was cold, because I wanted the air. I thought about what Dana had said. It's about time. And I thought about all the years I had spent making myself smaller so that everyone around me could feel larger. And I thought about how strange it was that the hardest thing I had ever done was simply stop. Just stop absorbing. Stop smoothing. Stop making the problem disappear so that no one had to look at it. I stopped, and the world didn't end. My family didn't fall apart. My mother made the soup, and I, for the first time in longer than I could remember, felt exactly the right size.